Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you. Today we're going to do another installment of Senior Nutrition. Simple, nutritious dishes for folks who cook on a budget, cook for just one or two, and get paid once a month. This is apricot glazed pork chops, portobello mushrooms, which you might do fresh on payday, but you could use canned toward the end of the month, and cabbage and onion noodles. If you like our videos and this series in particular, give us a thumbs up and subscribe and click the little bell in the top right corner and you'll get a notice when I post new videos. Now let's make something good. So let's talk about ingredients. I have over here some pork chops. Now I bought a pork loin for $1.55 a pound. I split it up into a couple of small loin roast and I sliced some and I put them in the freezer. This is for 3-ounce chops and this is for 2 people. Here's some cabbage. I bought a whole head. I used a quarter. And this is 1 onion. And these are portobello mushrooms, which I don't normally buy except on payday. I was by a store. I found these in a clearance rack. They were 75 cents a piece. I've got some butter. I've got some cumin. I've got some garlic powder. And as always, I have some salt. Now, I find that pork goes really well with a fruit flavor. And this is a really easy apricot glaze. It's just sugar-free apricot preserves. Apple does well. Actually, apple butter does well. And any berry preserves are also good. I thawed these little chops in the fridge, and I've just taken them out, and I'm going to salt them. And by the way, I use kosher salt because it sticks to the meat better, and it's not quite as salty as regular salt. So if it looks to you like I'm using a lot, part of that's because it's kosher salt. That's just a little sprinkle of cumin. You know, I talk about cumin a lot. It really brings the flavor of meat out. Little garlic powder here. If you don't have cumin and it's going to be a while before you can get it, just skip it. Turmeric works too, but cumin is really good. And when you're buying spices, if you can find some ground cumin, it just brings a lot of flavor. And you know, our older palates need that flavor. So I've just turned those over. I'm going to salt, garlic, and cumin on both sides. And then I'm going to leave them out, not put them right back in the fridge. It won't be long, about 20 minutes. But I'm going to let them warm up a little bit toward room temperature. That helps with the browning, along with the salt, mostly because it helps the surface dry out a little. And if you dry the surface out a little, then you get better browning and therefore you get more flavor. It also helps seal the meat so that you retain the moisture inside. So I'm just going to make sure that that salt and spice mixture is on all of them. And then I'll set this aside. You know, if it was the summer, I might not leave it out for more than about 10 minutes, but it's not the summer. It's kind of cool in my kitchen. So about 20 minutes. Of course, meat shouldn't stay out long, but 20 to 30 minutes is safe. So that darn cameraman didn't turn on the camera when I was cleaning these mushrooms, but you want to cut out the core and scrape out the black gills. And I'll say again, this works just fine with some nice canned mushrooms. I even have some dried mushrooms that will work. So now I have an onion. I've already cleaned it and cut the ends off. And I'm going to slice this kind of a special way. I really encourage folks to use onions as a vegetable. So I sliced it in half, and now I'm going to make very thin slices. And I'll talk a little bit about cutting things. You know, I'm not real happy with this knife. I haven't sharpened my knives in a little while. I probably need to sharpen this one. But we want to cut this thin because we're going to make something that's that's kind of a vegetable substitute for noodles. And I know noodles are cheap and easy and convenient, but you know, so many of us are diabetic or pre-diabetic that we are always looking for something to substitute for using noodles. And even if you're not diabetic, too many noodles is not good. They're just not good for you. Too much pasta. Okay, this is a better knife. So let me talk a little bit about cutting. Neither you nor I are Julia Child, and we have no need to show off our cutting skill and speed. It's very important that we don't cut our fingers. And I don't know about you, but I have carpal tunnel. So when I'm cutting, I wedge the knife up and down. I don't do a straight up and down chop. The pressure on your hand is different with an up and down chop. The wedge cut helps the wrist, and you need to put your finger out on the top of the blade. That helps guide it and gives you a little bit of extra pressure. Be sure you fold your fingers back and move them along. No need to get in a rush. We're just cutting this very thinly. And I'll say again, you know, it's very important for you to keep a sharp knife. You're more likely to hurt yourself with a dull knife. I have a nice little electric knife sharpener because I never quite got the knack of sharpening my own knives. My husband always did that. A knife sharpener is cheaper than a new knife. So let's talk about cabbage. If you like cabbage, and I love it, and if you think you don't like cabbage, you might if you fix it different ways. But cabbage is a great vegetable for somebody on a budget. You can get it, sometimes you can get it for 19 cents a pound. And this is about a half of a small to medium head of cabbage. And I'm just slicing it thinly, and you know, I think I missed the core. I didn't cut the cabbage exactly right, the head exactly right. If I were cooking just for myself tonight, I would use a quarter head of cabbage. I usually use a quarter head of cabbage for most dishes. And this time I'm using a half head because what I'm doing, I'm cooking for two, but one is for tonight and one is for the freezer. One meal is for the freezer. So I'm going to turn this just a little bit, the camera, so you get a little bit better view of the cut. So you need, as I say, a good sharp knife, and you see how thinly I'm slicing that. And it's going to cook quickly because you really don't want to overcook cabbage. You need just a tiny little bit of bite in it. Not necessarily crunch, but you don't want it soggy. So when you get close to the end, just flip it over and then start cutting from that end so you're not getting too close to your fingers. Now that's a lot of cabbage. I'm going to put that other quarter head back in the fridge and use it. You know, you've got several days to use it. Cabbage, I use a lot of cabbage because it stores for a long time, as long as you have it in a cool, dark place. If it hasn't been refrigerated, you don't even generally have to refrigerate it if you have a cool cellar. That's going back in the fridge. You know, within the week, I'll cook it, and it'll be just fine as long as you keep it sealed up. And then I'm just going to slice up these portobellos. You know, I have to say, I love portobello mushrooms, but they're ugly when they're cooked. And so, if you would prefer to use either the small sliced white mushrooms or some canned mushrooms, either one is just fine. As I say, I got these because they were on a sale table. A little grocery store that I sometimes go to has a reduced produce table, and have wonderful buys, but it's stuff that you've got to cook right now. It's not things I put in storage. So here we go. This is our whole meal. We've got our pork chops, our cabbage, our onion. I'm going to take my butter and spices and meet you at the stove. This is 3 tablespoons of butter. I melted it and then I turned the heat down. My stove has 9 notches. I turned it down to about 3. And I'm going to start with the onions. And I'm going to cook the onions just long enough for them to start browning. The pan's still pretty hot. It's going to cool down pretty quickly. Now I'm using 2 pans tonight, and as far as cleanup goes, all these little bowls that I put things in, if you're cooking at home alone, you don't have to do that. You can cut things and put them directly in the pan. I just use the bowls for demonstration purposes. If I'm not cooking for a video, I usually don't use those prep bowls. So we're just going to let these brown a little bit, and I'm going to put just a little salt on these because they weren't salted when I was prepping, and because a little bit of salt, you know, and that was probably a half a teaspoonful. A little bit of salt helps them wilt and helps pull the moisture out. And that moisture is the main reason I'm not doing this all in one pan, because I would have a lot less if I were cooking for just one, and probably it would all fit in one pan. But there's going to be a lot of moisture, and I'm going to glaze my pork chops. So I'm cooking them separately. So the cleanup's going to be, considering if you don't use these bowls, the cleanup's going to be two pans, a plate, and your utensils, knife and fork, and the things that I use to cook. So I know this looks really overfull, but you know how much it's going to shrink. The cabbage is going to shrink way down. And still, this is 2 big servings. And a little bit more salt right on top. We want to wilt those too. Now, if your doctor and nurse are like my doctor and nurse, you know, kind of busybodies, they're going to ask you what you eat and how many servings of vegetables and fruits you get. Well, you know, if you're getting paid once a month, it's kind of hard to have fresh vegetables all month. So I rely heavily on cabbage and onions and root vegetables like carrots and parsnips and rutabagas and turnips. Those are great vegetables, along with a variety of frozen vegetables. Now I'm turning this down as low as it will go, covered it up. I'll be back in about 10 minutes. So it's actually been about 7 minutes, and I'm going to take the lid off and stir these around. They will be letting go of their moisture now, and they'll be softening up. You can see they've already shrunk a little bit. This is still going to be a really good size serving. You know, and think of this as 2 vegetables, not 1, because you've got your onions and your cabbage, so you're getting 2 servings of vegetables here. And the smell, I mean, I just have to tell you, to me, I have childhood memories of cabbage cooking, and it just brings all those back, and to me, the smell just makes my mouth water. I mean, I like cabbage too as coleslaw in a salad, but cooked in butter with some onions and maybe a little bit of bacon, nothing better. My friend Faye Burton mentioned this today in the group, and it made me start craving it. And see all that liquid down in there? What we're basically doing here is steaming this in its own liquid. We're cooking it slowly to make that liquid release, and we're going to cover it up now about another, I don't know, close to 10 minutes, and it'll be about done. Except that I forgot. I wanted to add just a little bit of oregano to this. You can add any kind of spices you like. You could add a little Italian seasoning, is good too. And I didn't add pepper, but you probably want to add some black pepper. So it's been about another 7 minutes, and I'm moving this all over to the side, and I'm putting in, that's a generous tablespoonful of butter, and I'm going to let that melt and move the pan so that I can bring my pork chop pan up to pay attention to it. It has a little butter too. Let me say, I know that there are some folks, well, I'm going to put the mushrooms back in there as soon as that butter pretty much melts. There are some folks that are just not comfortable with the amount of butter I use, and that's fine. You don't have to if you don't want to. I'm just going to say, please don't use margarine. Butter is a good fat. It's good for your brain. Margarine, not so much. If you don't want to use that much butter, use a good oil. I'm salting those mushrooms just a little bit, but not margarine. Julia Child always said you don't have to use butter, but you'll be sorry if you don't. I'm sprinkling just a little bit of garlic powder on those mushrooms too. And I moved them over to another eye because that eye on my stove, that burner on my stove is a low BTU burner. So this pan is up to temp. You can tell because that butter has just started browning. You can see the little bit of browning over to the right. And I'm going to put these pork chops in. And I know they're going to fit in this 9-inch pan, but you use whatever you've got for the size pork chops that you have. Now what I'm going to do is brown them on both sides. I cut these very thinly, so they're going to cook pretty quickly. So by the time they get brown on both sides, they'll be almost done. I've got this on a medium to low heat. Once I get the pan up to temperature, I don't have the heat very high because I don't want to scorch them, but I do want to get a little browning for the flavor. For those of you who haven't heard me explain it before, the browning is called the Maillard reaction, and it's not just about how the meat looks, it's about how the meat tastes. So I turned it over and I'm browning the other side, and now I'm going to put just little bits of some apricot preserves. As I said, a berry preserve is great. If you have a blackberry preserve, oh my, that's very good. And I do have blackberry preserves, but I wanted to use these apricot up. And with a separate spoon, a fork, I'm going to just spread that out over the surface of this meat. And then flip them. And let that glaze in the little bit of butter that's left in the pan. And you know, that's not an expensive addition. I keep sugar-free preserves. You know, to be honest with you, I almost never eat toast or bread, so I end up using it for glazes on meat, and it works just perfectly. Easy, easy glaze. And you know, these pork chops would taste wonderful without the glaze, but we're cooking on a budget. We're going to find ourselves eating the same thing over and over. It'd be rare that we would buy a steak on a budget. So anything you can do to change up the flavor, to add an extra layer, is going to keep you more interested in your food. I'm 70, but my mother is 88, and one of the things I find is that sometimes she just won't eat because everything begins to taste the same, and she doesn't want to cook. So treat yourself. Spice your food up a little bit. Add some layers of flavor. I mean, I bought a whole pork loin and cut it up and put it in my freezer. I'm going to want to cook it several different ways or I'll get bored. So I've moved this around to make sure that the spots that aren't really brown are closer to the heat. And I'm going to cover it for just a little bit, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, just to make sure the meat is done all the way through. And it's been about 2 or 3 minutes. We're getting that last piece browned off a little bit. This is done. If your pork chop is thicker, you're going to have to cook it longer. I purposely cut these fairly thin, about 3 ounces a piece. I did weigh them. Everything back here looks like it's about done. I'm going to plate this up and we'll see what we got. And dinner is served. I'm going to cut this pork chop and show you. These are going to be very, very juicy. And you know, cooking a thin pork chop, it's kind of hard to keep them juicy. But these are, you salt them, brown them nicely, and then glaze them with the sugar-free preserves of your choice. They're going to be juicy. And this one, the flavor, you know, that little bit of fruit, that little fruity flavor just sets off the flavor of pork. Now I'm going to try one of these mushrooms. I love mushrooms, but you know, as I said, they're not very attractive. But that's okay. They taste wonderful. They really bumped the price of this plate up. We're talking about maybe $3 for this plate with my budget consciousness on every other item. You go back down to about $2 a plate if you just drain some canned mushrooms and brown them at the end. Or leave the mushrooms out if you're not a mushroom fan. The cabbage and onions is giving you 2 servings of vegetables. And see that texture? They're still firm enough. You can use these in so many ways. I like them just like this. I like them topped with a spaghetti sauce instead of noodles. And you know they make a great foundation for beef stroganoff over the top. And yes, they're a little more trouble than opening a box of noodles or cooking some rice. But all in all, for our senior health, they're much better for us. So here we have a wonderful plate of food for around $3 or around $2, depending on the mushrooms you use. It's good for us. It has healthy fat, has plenty of protein, 2 servings of vegetables. The mushrooms are neither meat nor vegetable, but they're good and they have a lot of protein in them. Look at that juicy pork chop. Thank you for joining us on Debbie's Back Porch. Hope to see you again tomorrow. And we're going to talk some more about senior nutrition, eating well on a budget all month long.